Hey everybody, good evening, and thank you for tuning in to GIPL's Eco-Faith from Home, 30 Days of Climate Action. We want to especially thank the Ray C. Anderson Foundation and Drawdown Georgia for making this 30-day event possible. Through their leadership and financial support, we've pulled together a variety of climate, faith, environmental experts, as you'll see tonight in another one of our events, to educate us on how we can combat the climate crisis right here in Georgia and tonight at the federal level. Tonight, our workshop, Beyond Your Home, Federal Climate Advocacy, will be led by none other than Jonathan Laycock-Nisley, who is the Federal Policy Associate for National Interfaith Power and Light, Molly Rausch, the Public Health Policy Director for Moms Clean Air Force, and Liz Pereira, Climate Policy Director for Federal Policy with the Sierra Club. Just a few reminders before we get started. This workshop will be recorded. You can view the recording and share the recording from GIPL's Facebook page and YouTube page. Please keep your cameras off and your mic muted for the duration of the presentations. We will have 3 presentations tonight. We'll start with Jonathan, and then it will go to Liz, and then it will go to Molly. After which I will ask a couple of questions, and then we will open it up for Q&A on anything that you all have to talk about. So whether you are in Zoom or you're on Facebook, please just comment your questions and we'll gather them and bring them to our presenters. Also on May 1st, GIPL launched our Spring Appealing campaign, and we are in the process of raising funds so that we can continue to put on events like this and continue to equip faith leaders to engage in federal advocacy. So please consider going to gipl.org/donate if you feel so inclined to participate in that campaign. And with no further ado, Jonathan, I will pass it off to you to talk about what the federal landscape is on policy and why people of faith should be engaged in that work. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Cody. It's great to be with you all. So yeah, like Cody said, I'm the Federal Policy Associate for National Interfaith Power and Light. And so it's my honor and privilege to represent Georgia IPL and 36 other IPL state affiliates across the country on Capitol Hill, and do the work of connecting people of faith like you with your members of Congress so that you can speak out for good legislation that cares for our creation. I think it's so valuable to do this work, do policy advocacy for good climate laws in faith communities, because all of our faith communities have the shared values that are needed for action on the climate crisis. We all value the divine gift of this earth, our common home. We all value the divine gift of breath, of life. And we know that those gifts are threatened when we burn fossil fuels for our energy. I think that when the message of the climate crisis comes from people of faith, politicians, our elected leaders, they hear that message a little bit differently. I think often when they, hear about the climate crisis, they might hear about it as a scientific issue. Hopefully they recognize it's a social issue. But when they hear about it from people of faith, I think they hear about it as a moral issue. And so that is the framework that we can use, and that really helps break through some of the partisanship that can so easily break down conversations on environmental issues. So I don't know, maybe you can drop in the chat what experience you have contacting your members of Congress. Have you sent emails, made calls? Have you had a meeting with a congressional staffer? Let us know what you've done so far, and then hopefully tonight we can help you get ready to take that next step. So I'm going to share my screen here. And talk a little bit about the opportunity of this present moment. We have really a generational opportunity to impact legislation on the climate crisis. Right now, Congress is writing an infrastructure package. President Biden has laid out an outline for a $2 trillion investment in our country's infrastructure, both because that infrastructure has been, crumbling for far too long, but also as a way to help get our economy going again and create jobs coming out of the COVID pandemic. And so I think often when politicians, maybe when anyone hears infrastructure, the first thing they think is roads and bridges. And certainly there are a lot of roads and bridges in our country that need help. But I think we have a special role to play in making sure that when they hear infrastructure, they're hearing the basic question: what do our communities need to thrive? And clean energy has to be at the top of that list. So one of the things that's really exciting in President Biden's proposal is that it would create a national clean energy standard for the first time. There are a number of states across the country that have clean energy standards. This would create a national one for the first time, and it would put us on a timeline to achieve President Biden's campaign promise of 100% clean electricity by 2035. So that's really exciting and something that we should definitely be raising up to our elected leaders. It would also make a bunch of investments in clean energy. There are tax credits that have helped make solar panels accessible to homes across the country, helped make wind power popular even in states that maybe their leaders don't care so much about acting on climate, but they do care when they see that wind power is one of the cheapest ways to make electricity, and that's thanks to these tax credits. And so it would extend those tax credits to keep the momentum going on creating clean energy and clean energy jobs. We've also seen too often in the past year that our electrical grid needs to be updated. We saw, a devastating situation in Texas when a kind of routine winter storm ended up with so many households lacking access to electricity and heat. And so we can see that our electrical grid isn't ready for the climate disruptions that are starting to happen. And certainly it needs investments to be ready for the disruptions that are coming. And when we're making those investments in our electrical grid, this is also a time that we can be preparing the grid for a future where we have solar on every rooftop or almost every rooftop, because that's not the way the grid is built right now, but we can make the investments so that it's ready for that future. Our water infrastructure faces similar challenges right now, maybe challenges that are even more a matter of injustice. Flint, Michigan is kind of the face of the crisis of lead pipes in this country. This infrastructure package would remove every lead pipe across the country, which would be an enormous achievement for our communities, for the health of our children. It's an issue, like too many environmental and climate issues, that disproportionately affects Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. So we can be lifting up those water investments as a central justice issue. Another issue that disproportionately affects those same neighborhoods is pollution from our transportation systems. And this infrastructure package would help us move away from relying on, single passenger motorized vehicles that are burning fossil fuels. So it would expand U.S. investments in electric vehicles, help put electric charging stations in communities across the country, and it would also boost our investments in public transportation, creating new routes and also electrifying our trains and buses. The final thing I'll say that's really exciting about this package is that it calls for Congress to invest with justice. One of the promises of President Biden's campaign, and one of the things that we're really excited to see in his proposal, is the call that 40% of the funds spent on the climate crisis be spent in the communities that have been affected the most by our fossil fuel economy. Again, it's those same communities, Black and brown communities and low-income communities, who have borne that disproportionate burden of pollution from our use of fossil fuels. And so now is the time for faith communities to be speaking up, to be calling on our prophetic traditions and saying that we can do better. We can envision a more just, more equitable future, and we can see the investments that are needed to pass our common home onto our children in a livable form. So I'm asking you tonight, after we're done, you can do this, to call into your members of Congress. We have a link, and I can put it in the chat in just a second, that will take you through a very simple script. And if you're a little nervous about talking to a real person, now's the perfect time to call, because you'll just get an answering machine. And you can leave that message, because Congress is writing this legislation right now. So this is the perfect time for us to make our voices heard. So with that, I'll pass it to Liz.
Thanks, Jonathan. That was fantastic and wonderful to be with all of you tonight. My name is Liz Pereira, and I serve as our Climate Policy Director for the Sierra Club here in Washington, D.C. And yes, I am here to dig in a little bit more on some of what Jonathan has laid out and talk about this incredibly historic opportunity that we have in front of us. And in the next probably 6 months, we are going to potentially see our federal government invest more money in our economy than we've seen since the New Deal. And we have an amazing opportunity to shape that investment and really build a clean energy economy, move away from fossil fuels, and do so in an equitable and just way. And it is extremely exciting, and we absolutely need everyone's help on this call here to actually bring that message to Congress right now, and really, lift up all of the faith voices that you know and your neighbors, and encourage them to bring this message to Congress. And you've probably already seen President Biden in his first 100 days has taken significant, bold action, including a number of executive actions and orders on the climate crisis and the pandemic. Since he's been sworn in, Biden has rejected the Keystone XL pipeline. He's rejoined the Paris Climate Agreement. He's set new and ambitious climate commitment of 50 to 52% by 2030. He has also re-granted California's Clean Air Act waiver to implement stronger protections from car emissions. He has repeatedly paused onshore and offshore fossil fuel leases. And he also signed the American Rescue Plan into law, which many of us know has really made a difference in our ability to recover from this pandemic. And in general, we are seeing that this president and this cabinet are really they are centering racial injustice, economic inequality, and the climate crisis all together. It's these interconnected crises that they are centering. And, it's really up to all of us to work with them and use every tool at our disposal to address these interconnected crises. We've also seen in the past few weeks, Washington is starting to move to, as Jonathan laid out, this big, bold infrastructure package. And many of you may have heard of the Thrive Agenda, the Thrive Act that we joined with 250 other groups, with Interfaith Power and Light, and many, many groups to push for what we say are three really important things when we talk about this economic renewal package, which are scale, scope, and standards. And the important thing to remember, these three S's are what we need to remember in this overarching package. In terms of scale, the president is talking about spending potentially $1 trillion a year over the next 4 years. That is the level of investment our economy needs to renew and recover from this pandemic. We know that an investment of $1 trillion per year will create 15 million good jobs, deliver full employment, and really get us on the path to cut pollution nearly half by 2030. It can also really address racial, economic, and gender and environmental injustice if it's done right. So I encourage you to go to the Thrive Agenda website, read more about that. It has over 100 members of Congress supporting it, and a lot of union, racial justice, and climate groups. The scope is exactly what Jonathan was laying out. The scope can't just be what we think of as roads, bridges, the basic things we think of when we think of infrastructure. We need to really invest to replace our lead pipes all over the country, to deliver clean water to our communities. We need to build clean and affordable public transit. We need to ensure that we have a reliable electric grid, like Jonathan said. That terrible winter storm that hit Texas and brought Texas down. We can create over 4 million jobs in clean energy as we expand access to wind and solar power, electric vehicles, clean energy, clean and healthy buildings. We can do a lot with energy efficiency upgrades with all of our buildings and homes. And there's also jobs that can be created by protecting wetlands, forests, investing in family-friendly farmers, that's the bigger infrastructure that we're talking about. We're talking about an economic renewal plan for our nation. And the third thing, standards, is really the question of what kind of economy are we going to be building for our children and our grandchildren. We want to deliver an economy that is racially just, that follows all of the principles that we know many of the faith leaders in our nation follow, of equity and justice. And so we want to call, and the Thrive Agenda calls for strong labor, equity, and environmental standards to build a more just economy. And, we know that we can do this. We know that the president has already committed to Buy American, committed to making sure that we grow good, equitable jobs. And this infrastructure package, as Jonathan laid out, also makes a really historic commitment to invest 40% of the investment proceeds into disadvantaged communities, called the Justice 40 commitment from the president. And that is also a critical component, because we know that if we can focus investment in communities that have been hardest hit by this pandemic and really need the economic renewal, that is going to help our entire nation. So those are the three tenets of the Thrive Agenda as a way of thinking of overarching what we're asking for in this economic renewal plan. And there are a lot of specifics underneath that we can dig into more, especially in the question and answer. But just to talk a little bit about, I know we're all very focused on moving from fossil fuels to the clean energy economy and 100% clean energy. So one of the bills that was just introduced in the past 2 weeks is the Clean Energy for America Act, which is Senate Finance Chairman Ron Wyden's bill, that actually does what Jonathan was laying out, gives us those tax credits that we need to make sure that we can afford putting solar in our homes, driving EVs, doing the things we know we need to do to transition to this clean energy economy, and really can put people to work. This bill also eliminates wasteful subsidies for the fossil fuel and nuclear industry. And along with these solar and offshore wind and storage transmission and efficiency, building electrification investments, they are going to it is estimated that they will create 600,000 good paying jobs a year as they tackle the climate crisis with this bill. So I just wanted to lift that bill up because it really does do the suite of things that I know folks on this call are very interested in. And there are a lot of other bills that are focused on eliminating fossil fuel subsidies and ensuring polluting industry pays for environmental cleanup, which is also extremely important. And as you heard Jonathan mention, there's also President Biden is asking Congress to pass a energy efficiency and clean electricity standard. And this is similar, many of you have these in your states and cities. This is a commitment to renewables and clean energy. And so we are also seeing some interest in Congress for that. And there are some proposals that are coming out. We know that there is a huge amount that needs to be done in terms of electrifying and modernizing our transportation infrastructure, and transitioning away from dirty diesel buses. We really can work hard to build transit and do so in an equitable and just way. So those are a few of the things one more thing. There's a lot going on in this package. Wait, there's more. There's also a fantastic protection of our great public lands, our beautiful American public lands, where President Biden has committed to protect 30% of our public lands and waters by 2030 and 50% by 2050, because we know that nearly 1/4 of our greenhouse gas emissions come from fossil fuels mined, drilled on national public lands. People don't realize that underneath the public lands, they are drilling and extracting oil. And that counts for nearly 1/4 of our greenhouse gas pollution from the nation. And in addition, it's one of the most cost-effective means to reducing carbon pollution and really investing in carbon sinks, our forests, our wetlands. So this is a great way to actually commit to not only protecting the public lands we love to visit every time we get a chance. Hopefully after the pandemic, we'll all be going back out to our public lands and visiting those and going to our parks. But it's also a huge solution for climate change. So I wanted to highlight a few of those proposals that we're going to be seeing in the infrastructure package. And we can talk further in the question and answer.
Thank you, Liz.
Yeah, and happy to talk more about anything else you'd like to, Cody. And now I'm going to pass it to Molly Roush.
Thanks, Liz. Hi, everyone. Great to be with you and great to learn from Jonathan and Liz. I am Molly Roush. I'm the Public Health Policy Director with Moms Clean Air Force. I'm based in DC, and Moms Clean Air Force organizes moms from across the country in over a dozen states, including Georgia, to fight for clean air and a stable climate for the sake of our children's health. And we have loved partnering with IPL in many different states where we work. So it's wonderful to be here with you. I am so excited about all the momentum and really appreciated that big picture view. And what I think I'm going to do is just focus on 3 really specific opportunities right now to take action on climate change that Moms Clean Air Force is working on and that you all can also take action on. I'm going to start with a vote that happened last week in the Senate on methane. So methane is a very potent greenhouse gas, much more climate warming than carbon dioxide in the first decades after it is released into the atmosphere. And there's a big problem of methane leaking from oil and gas operations across the country. And the Trump administration basically rolled back Obama era regulations on methane emissions from oil and gas. And so reinstating those standards for methane has been a really important sort of first step in getting a handle on methane pollution. Today is actually World Asthma Day, and asthma is a major issue for our moms, our families, our members across the country. And it's actually highly relevant to methane pollution because not only is methane a very potent greenhouse gas, but it is also a volatile organic compound. It is a type of chemical that when it is in the presence of heat and sunlight, it combines in a chemical way to form ground level ozone or smog. And smog is a powerful lung irritant that triggers asthma attacks and interferes with normal lung development and actually makes lungs more vulnerable to infection. And ozone can form dozens of miles from where those pollutants are first released, even hundreds of miles. So even if you don't live in a state or even in a county or a state where there's oil and gas operations, the pollution coming out of those well pads can drift over through weather patterns to your state, to your city, to your metro area, say if you're in Atlanta or DC where I live, and can contribute to ozone pollution, making asthma worse in our major cities. So methane is a climate issue. It's an asthma issue. There are a lot of other problems with methane pollution because it leaks right alongside things like benzene and formaldehyde, which cause cancer, and frontline communities bear the brunt of that. And many of those communities are communities of color and low income. So methane pollution is also a justice issue. So the Congress has introduced a resolution to basically clear the pathway to reinstate Obama-era methane regulations. And the Senate passed that resolution last week. It garnered bipartisan support in the Senate, and it passed with a 10-vote margin. So I'm going to give you a little sort of inside the Beltway strategy around this. We were 3 Republicans voted in support of this resolution. That doesn't sound like a huge bipartisan vote, but it's actually quite meaningful in this highly partisan age to have 3 Republicans join in on this. And what's also meaningful is that many Republicans didn't vote. They didn't go on record. So there was actually a 10-vote spread. The resolution passed the Senate 52-42. So that 10-vote spread is telling. Those Republicans who didn't vote did not want to go on record in a vote that could be interpreted as being anti-climate action. And all of that is because of you and other advocates around the country who are clamoring for climate action, who understand this to be a moral threat and a threat to our families and our children and their future and what we love most in this world. And so raising our voices on that issue, that's making a difference. And that might not be apparent when you see that only 3 Republicans voted for it, but it's just really important to kind of read between the lines and understand what's happening, that our voices are making a difference. The other thing is that methane standards are popular. Even some of the largest oil and gas companies are supportive of there being methane regulations in place. It's helpful for them to have that kind of stability, and they're also trying to figure out ways to publicly recognize the climate crisis and own up to the massive pollution that they're causing. And so there's some industry support. So now that the Senate passed this resolution, it's time for the House to do it. And it's up to us to put pressure on our lawmakers to continue that momentum. And after my remarks, I'll drop into the chat a link for, where you can take action on the Moms Clean Air Force website. But obviously, you can also always just make a phone call to your representatives, tell them that you want climate action and that you want them to vote yes on the methane resolution, which would reinstate methane standards for the oil and gas industry. So that's a really big initiative for us, and we expect there to be a vote within the next couple of weeks on that. So that's a really this is an urgent moment to raise our voices on this. And obviously it's just a first step in getting a handle on this emissions source, but it's also really important because it's the first congressional vote on a major climate issue in a long time. So it's really exciting that we got this win last week, and I'm still walking on air about that. The other issue I did want to touch on is, and we've heard about this from Jonathan and Liz, is the electrification of our transportation sector. And Moms Clean Air Force has been paying a lot of attention to the momentum in Congress to work on electrifying yellow school buses. So hundreds of thousands of kids, when they're in school, travel to and from school on a yellow school bus that is powered by a diesel engine. And diesel pollution is carcinogenic. It's recognized by the World Health Organization as a carcinogen, and it also is an asthma trigger. It cuts lives short. It causes heart attacks. It causes asthma to develop in otherwise healthy children, actually. It's not just an asthma trigger, it's a cause of the development of the disease of asthma. We don't want our kids breathing it, for sure. And interestingly, a lot of research points to the fact that when you sit on a bus that's powered by a diesel engine, that diesel pollution is actually, those levels are very high inside the cabin of the bus. They build up in there. And so the idea is that kids who ride school buses to and from school and drivers who drive those buses are basically being delivered this load of diesel pollution every single day, twice a day. Not to mention the fact that these buses often idle in front of schools and obviously drive through our communities. So there's pollution that goes along with those buses in our communities. There's a ton of momentum in Congress around this issue. It's a top priority of Vice President Harris. She introduced a bill in when she was senator around this issue, and the American Jobs Plan does include funding for electric school buses. In other words, transitioning our school bus fleet to electric powered motors, which is actually really interesting for school buses because there's a lot of the day in which they're idle. Some of the charging issues that are of concern to the heavy duty vehicles, trucks, that we need a little more like ripening of the technology, were basically there already for the buses because they have these idle times in the day when they can be recharged. So Senator Warnock actually was an initial co-sponsor of an act, the Clean Commute for Kids Act, and that designates $25 billion to electrify our school bus fleet. And it's actually sort of part of the Thrive agenda, which you heard about from Liz. Sorry, I got that wrong. It's not part of the Thrive agenda. It's part of another overarching suite where I'm missing the name. It's really exciting to be drinking from a fire hose right now in Congress. There are so many initiatives and acronyms that it's hard to keep them straight. But the Clean Commute for Kids Act, which Warnock is one of the co-sponsors of, is actually one of several bills currently introduced in the current Congress that are about electrifying school buses. So Moms Clean Air Force is really excited about that. We are supporting these bills. This is a really good time to actually talk to your representatives about the benefits of electrifying school buses for kids, for communities. Many of these initiatives include ways of prioritizing the money for communities that are suffering the most air pollution or are or dealing with underlying health conditions. So in other words, creating a justice component of this funding, which is really important to Moms Clean Air Force and obviously a priority of the Biden-Harris administration as well. So this is also relevant to Georgia because there's a handful of manufacturers in the US that are producing these, that are producing these buses, and one of them is in Georgia. So Bluebird is one of the nation's handful of electric bus manufacturers. So this kind of investment is actually going to directly benefit Georgia. So for those of you who are in Georgia, this is a really great moment to raise this up with your representatives and raising the justice issues, the health issues, the climate issues, but also your state economy, because this is really going to direct money toward an in-state manufacturer. So it's a really exciting time when all of that comes together. And then finally, I did want to touch on something that Liz did mention also, which is the Biden administration's efforts to clean up the transportation sector with regards to cars. So there's been an announcement from EPA last week that they intended to reinstate the longstanding state authority to set their own greenhouse gas emission standards for cars and light trucks. And this announcement opens the first public docket for EPA under Administrator Michael Regan. So this move would once again give California and other states that choose to adopt California's standards permission to set stricter climate pollution standards for cars, reversing a Trump administration policy. Under the Clean Air Act, California, well, other states can adopt California standards, and many have, and these are referred to as Section 177 states, and that's named after the relevant section of the Clean Air Act. And they include a lot of East Coast states like Connecticut and Delaware, Maine, Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, some West Coast states, Oregon, Washington, obviously California, and DC, where I live. And there are some other states that are trying to join this. Together with California, all these Section 177 states represent more than a third of the nation's auto market. And the market share is very highly relevant because reinstating state authority to set stricter standards for 1/3 of the auto market is one way to push automakers to agree to more stringent national standards. They want a cohesive set of national standards, and we want them to agree to strict ones. So this sounds very convoluted. It's a reconsideration of a waiver under the Clean Air Act, but it's actually a key win for cleaner cars. And it's a critical step toward slashing climate pollution from vehicles. And perhaps most importantly, from an advocacy standpoint, it's the first public docket and first public hearing for the new Biden EPA under Regan's leadership. So we see this as a major opportunity to show that we demand climate action and we want EPA to get off on the right foot in their cars work and take a bold step. Now, this is just the beginning. We have to establish these, or rather I should say reestablish ambitious national standards for climate pollution from cars. And then we've got to establish them for trucks. And we need it to be on a very aggressive timeline. But from the advocacy perspective, we just have to take one step at a time. Right now, this step is trying to turn out support for this EPA announcement that it's reinstating California's waiver. So there's a lot of exciting things happening. Those are three of the ones that Moms Clean Air Force is working on right now. The public hearing I was mentioning is going to be on June 2nd, and that docket closes. You can actually put digital comments into the docket until the beginning of July. So there's a little bit of time to engage on the CARS waiver. But really excited to be involved in everything that's happening and just to continue to elevate our voices, not as experts, as people who feel the calling, the moral calling, a religious calling, the obligation as parents to protect our children's health, to protect their future. And we need to keep telling that story in all of these different settings. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Cody.
Thank you so much, Molly, for that. I appreciate it. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Liz, for what you have shared so far. I have a couple of questions here, and then we'll turn it over to all of you who are in the Zoom and those of you who are on Facebook. So be thinking of your questions or go ahead and drop them in the chat and I can lift them up. I wanted to start off with a question, and I'll just put it out there and you three can popcorn it around and answer it as you see fit. Jonathan, you mentioned this actually the other day as a part of the, I believe as a part of the IPL conference. But we've talked a lot of us have talked about like why this is such an important moment. Why is right now an important moment to pass a wide sweeping infrastructure package? And I think the phrase that I've heard is like, maybe we don't get two bites of the apple. Maybe right now is really important that we get all the things that we want. And I wonder if you all could elaborate a little bit on why this moment is unique and why we should be putting pressure on elected officials right now to pass a package like this right now.
I can go first if you'd like,
Yeah,
or Jonathan, go for it. It is really a very unique moment in time. And this is probably, obviously folks know that we are in the Senate very close to a hung Senate. So we're very tight in terms of a majority, although Democrats do have the majority. And Vice President Harris is the tie-breaking vote. And that is, and we don't have to talk about, because Georgia, you have been ground zero for all of these attacks on our democracy. And there is a real need right now to go big on reforming our nation and building an economic renewal like we've never seen, because there is an opportunity with such a strong administration and their leadership, and then Democratic leadership, climate friendly leadership in both houses of Congress, to really push for everything we can get. And this is a time period when our nation is ready to do an economic renewal package and knows that that's what we need to do to pull our nation out of the COVID-19 crisis, the pandemic. So it is a critical, I would say, once in a decade, once in a lifetime opportunity that we raise our voices right now. Obviously, with the way that lines are being redrawn and redistricting and attacks to our democracy. And by the way, the For the People Act, that's the bill that all of us are pushing for to help to protect our democracy. So you can also learn more about that and their action alerts on the Sierra Club website. I will direct you to. But that to me is why this is such a critical moment. And we can't let it pass us by.
Thanks, Liz. Molly or Jonathan, do you want to respond to that?
Well, I'll just respond sort of from the science perspective, right? We have run out of time. So every single moment that we wait makes it all the more critical that we act now. So we have this unique political situation that Liz was describing. We have the first president to have run and won on a climate platform, but we also have this this urgency based on chemistry and physics that has nothing to do with Washington. So I think that's part of the power of a group like IPL carrying that conviction and that passion into these conversations. We've waited too long, and it's urgent that we act now.
Thanks, Molly.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so, Liz talked about the political moment with the Senate, which is kind of a rarity. Molly talked about the climate imperative. The only thing I can add is that there's political momentum, political will for big investments right now, which is really rare, actually, from both parties. And coming out of the pandemic, as we're starting to see the light at the end of that tunnel and trying to get our economy moving again, there's this rare political will to make big, bold investments. So if we don't capitalize on that now, the moment could pass and we could miss it.
Yeah, thank you all. I think that helps answer that question well enough. The next one that I have is actually taking a step back from the infrastructure package and thinking about the other arms of government that influence the environment that maybe don't have to do with legislation. So now we have a situation where we have a more emboldened EPA, we have a renewed and emboldened Department of the Interior. And I just wanted to ask, what do you hope and what can we expect out of those bodies now that they are renewed and refreshed and actually work under an administration that is prioritizing climate?
Well, maybe I could start. I mean, one thing that's really important is that, at least in the case of EPA, it's been hollowed out, right? It has a renewed and refreshed mandate, but it actually needs to rebuild its workforce. So a lot of the congressional initiatives are, we need to pour some money into the agency itself. So there's that. But once they get back on their feet, there's a lot of regulatory rollbacks that EPA needs to fix before it even gets back to kind of baseline and can take further action. EPA has a ton of work to do. And this is just one of the agencies that addresses a lot of our climate issues. Obviously, it's a multi-agency, all of government problem, as Biden's been discussing. But so I think the methane pollution that I was talking about earlier, the vote in Congress is just to kind of clear away the Trump rollback. And that doesn't even get to taking it further and actually limiting methane from the existing sources. The resolution that Congress is taking up has to do with reinstating standards for new oil and gas infrastructure. These are all the well pads and pipelines and compressor stations that are in the planning stages. But those are, I mean, if you think about it, those don't even exist yet. They're not actually polluting anything. The methane pollution we have to deal with is all of the existing infrastructure. EPA hasn't even started on that. So, I mean, this is one of just a dozen things. There's a lot of work that EPA has to do. Now, I feel like that can feel a little bit overwhelming, but for me, it's just galvanizing as an advocate. You know, we have our work cut out for us. We need to be calling for bold action at every one of these junctures. Every time these climate related public dockets open, we need to flood them, because EPA and our lawmakers need to understand how much political will there is for this action. So to me, it's just like, yeah, let's get ready. Let's like get those muscles fit and lace up our sneakers. We have so much work to do as advocates to kind of back up all of the work that EPA has to do. And I focus a lot on EPA. I know there's a broad range of other agencies that we also have to look at.
Thanks, Molly.
And I'll just add to Molly, because she's done such a great job with EPA. There are other parts of obviously Interior and CEQ, which is the part of the government that actually helps us to implement the National Environmental Policy Act, which is how communities lift their voice in federal infrastructure projects. And we have Brenda Mallory is the new head of that. And there will be opportunities to call on CEQ, the Council of Environmental Quality, to actually really interpret the National Environmental Policy Act to protect us when big projects are proposed that are federal projects. And so that'll be really important as well. I know all of you too, I know there's the Okefenokee Swamp, the controversial mine that has been proposed in Charlottetown County. And I know that there's a big effort with Army Corps of Engineers. The Trump administration had actually made it much easier for that to go forward. So as Molly was saying, we have to dig ourselves out of a terrible situation that the last administration put us in, and roll back a lot of critical environmental public health rules. They rolled back a lot of the NEPA protections that we have to actually protect communities when these big projects are proposed, pipelines, mines, big infrastructure projects that really could be wrong for our community. So I wanted to just highlight that as a few. And then obviously Interior has a huge role to play in this. And Secretary Holland, who's the first Indigenous Secretary of the Department of the Interior, is really going to be providing incredible leadership there, and really engaging tribal leaders and environmental justice leaders from across the country, and helping to actually lift the voices of people who could be most impacted by these projects, implementing the 30 by 30 commitment to protect public lands. And so I think that they're going to need us to have their back and to be watching what's going on and supporting what's going on, because there's so much happening all at once, and there's so much for this administration to do that we have to really watch those particular things, lace up our sneakers, as Molly was saying, and get active, because people need to know what's going on and know why these things are so important for their communities.
Great. Thanks so much, Liz. Jonathan, they covered a lot, but I'll give you the opportunity if you want to jump in.
I guess the only thing I'll highlight, Molly talked earlier about clean car standards, and we're really excited to see new clean car standards from the EPA. And we think it's time for the EPA to follow California's lead and set a date for when we will stop selling new gas-powered cars in the US. We have the technology, we can make the investments with things like this infrastructure package to make electric vehicles much more affordable. And so we're excited to support that work.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. So this is my last question, and then we'll move on to some Q&A from those of you who are tuned in. I've gotten a lot of questions on the back end from people saying, so what are we asking our representatives to do? What are we asking our senators to do? And so I wonder if we could just do a very quick, at most, each of us offer one. At best, it's less than that. What are we asking people to do? If you could summarize a sentence for the people who are on here and the people who will be watching this, you know, when they call their representatives or senators, what are we asking them to do?
So I'll say a big, bold infrastructure package focused on climate. And I'll drop again, this link here has a script, so you can just have that word for word.
I fully agree with that. And if you are interested in the methane issue specifically, I would say call your representative, because the Senate has already voted on this, and ask them to vote yes to reinstate methane pollution standards from the oil and gas industry.
Absolutely. And I will put in an action in the chat as well, that we will also just add to that, totally support what my colleagues say here, to support the Wyden bill, which is that Clean Energy for America Act that actually puts the clean energy tax incentives in place and repeals fossil fuel subsidies. So I will put a link to that action in the chat.
Great, thank you all so much. So now everyone, sorry, go ahead, Molly.
Sort of tee off this.
Yeah.
I think the important thing right now is for our lawmakers to hear that we care about climate change, that it impacts our families and our communities, and that we see it as a matter of justice to take action right now. There's dozens of initiatives and bills and dockets and, you know, packages, and that can be very confusing. But actually, we often, with our advocates in meetings around the country, ask them to just say, what is your plan for dealing with this crisis and protecting my family and my community? We want them to know that we want action right now, and that we see this as a personal issue. This is not something that we accept that they're like, the experts are hashing that out somewhere far away from us. This is happening to us, and we demand action now. So I like to, you know, you all are seasoned advocates because you're in this conversation with us right now, but I like to impress upon people that the important thing is sharing that they care about climate action and asking their lawmakers, what's your plan to take care of this problem?
Thanks, Molly. Well, that is a good tee off.